Professor Lance Bush, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So, you are a moral psychologist and a meta-ethicist. For those who are in the audience used to thinking about ethics as the study of what's right and what's wrong, could you say a little bit about what's different about metaethics from that?
Yeah. So metaethics is a sort of subdiscipline within moral philosophy that deals with more abstract and fundamental questions about the nature of morality itself. So it asks questions like, are there moral truths? What do we mean when we make moral claims? How do we acquire moral knowledge? And so it doesn't directly address any concrete questions about what's morally right or wrong. It takes a step back and it looks at the practice of moral philosophy itself and says, what is this? What are we doing here? What are we trying to figure out? How do we go about doing the job of moral theorizing?
Fantastic. And just to, again, give people a bit of background, what are the sort of key positions around this debate in metaethics?
Well, there's a few different debates, but the biggest debate is I would say, the debate between moral realists and moral anti-realists. There are other disputes in metaethics. So there's questions about the relationship between moral belief and moral motivation, and that's a sort of internalist-externalist dispute about the relationship between belief and motivation. That's one big dispute, and the central question there is, if you believe something's morally right or wrong, does that necessarily entail that you have at least some, even if it's defeasible or overridable, some motivation to act on that belief? Or is that not strictly necessary? Is it possible, even if it's rare in practice, for you to believe something's morally right or wrong, but then be like, I'm not moved to do it? So that's one dispute. There's a number of other disputes. There are disputes, conditional on us thinking that there's a certain type of moral truth. You could then ask the question, okay, well, how would we know about it? Like, what's the means of acquiring moral knowledge? That's one question. So there's an epistemological question there. There's a sort of maybe a psychological and conceptual question with the internalism, externalism dispute. But the realism, anti-realism dispute often seems to me, at least, to take center stage in a lot of these disputes. And that isn't to say that there aren't really fascinating and important questions, but a lot of them seem to get sort of sucked up into this particular dispute like a vacuum. So questions about internalism and externalism end up being relevant to the realism, anti-realism dispute. Moral knowledge questions end up being relevant. So, for instance, some of the contemporary anti-realist views are motivated by evolutionary debunking arguments, which often target the epistemology, or how we would acquire moral knowledge if there were such a thing. So they all get wrapped up in this question of are there these, what people often use the term objective, but that term is used in a bunch of different ways, and it's not a great term to use. So these days people have shifted towards using a more technical term, stance independent. Are there stance independent moral facts or not? That's the central dispute. And so what that means is, for there to be stance independent moral facts, is, are there facts about what's morally right or wrong, good or bad, and so on, that are true independent of the attitudes, the preferences, the standards, the values of any individuals or any groups or any point of view or perspective? They're true. They're perspectiveless truths. That's moral realism. And then in contrast, moral anti-realism says, yeah, there's no facts of that kind. And then it's an open question what the relevant position you would then take as an anti-realist. Should I address like the main positions within that dispute?
Absolutely, if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah. So there's sort of 5 classical positions that are discussed in the literature. These could be further subdivided, and there's a couple caveats and qualifications. In philosophy, there's always people that take like hybrid positions, whatever. But I'll trot out the standard 5, and I'll say a little bit about the other positions. So on the realist side, you tend to have 2 main realist positions. You have naturalist realists and non-naturalist realists. So naturalist realists say, yes, there are stance-independent moral facts, and those facts are natural facts. And what does that mean? It's actually very hard. That opens up a whole Pandora's box of what's the natural, non-natural distinction. I don't even think there's a good answer to that question, but lots of people are going to hash that out and take perspectives on it. But very roughly, it would mean that they're the sort of facts that would be consistent with or discoverable through the empirical sciences, or they're sort of amenable to the kind of scientific worldview that we would ordinarily adopt, which would exclude supernatural and non-natural entities that couldn't be discovered, studied, analyzed, or understood in terms consistent with the sciences. So that's the naturalist perspective. Moral facts are going to be some kind of fact within a naturalist picture of the world. Non-naturalists, as the name suggests, go, nope, they're not like that. They're not natural facts. That doesn't tell you what they are. Some people might think, oh, so then they're like divine facts or supernatural. No, not at all. Actually, contemporary analytic philosophy is dominated by atheists. It's a significant majority of analytic philosophers are atheists, and that even includes, I believe it's most or very nearly most of moral realists are in fact also atheists, or at least not explicitly religious. Even those who are religious or are theists will often do not think that moral facts are dependent on or contingent on God or God's nature anyway. So you could still view their non-naturalist realist position in fully secular terms. So on this view, there are moral facts, and they're not the sorts of facts that would be understood in scientific terms. And that, naturally raises questions with well, okay, then how do we figure out what they are? And the most natural answer to that would be something like intuitions, but I'll leave that aside. That's
Maybe
that's
we
its
can
own
come
thing
to
too.
that later. And
Yeah.
roast G Moore 100 years after his death. But so, and then in terms of canvassing some of the anti-realist positions, we've got
So you got
one that people might have heard of as ones like moral relativism. But there
Mhm.
are, there are a few more that are definitely worth exploring. So, sorry, take it away.
Absolutely. Okay, so you got three standard positions. One, I actually prefer the term stance-dependent cognitivism, which is more technical
Hmm.
sounding, but basically it's the view that, hey, when people make moral claims, those claims, they are capable of being true or false, but what makes them true are people's standards, people's stances, whether it be the stances of individuals or of groups. But in practice, when people are framing these positions, they usually say relativism or constructivism. So they use a few terms, and those are not the same thing. But we'll just stick with relativism. Okay, so relativists hold that the truth of moral claims can only be judged relative to one or another of different moral standards, whether they be the standards of individuals or groups. So in practice, they treat moral facts as stance dependent, which would make them anti-realists. They don't have to, which is a complication, but let's simplify. I don't know of any relativists that don't think moral facts are dependent on individuals or cultures. Okay, so the relativists do think that there are moral truths. They go, yeah, there's moral facts. But moral facts are facts about our preferences, or they're facts about what cultures have agreed to, or they're facts about like the reasons given to us by our desires or by cultural consensus or cultural agreement. So relativists are people that believe in moral facts. They just don't think that they're stance independent. So that gives you one type of anti-realism. There are moral facts, but they're stance dependent. Then you have two others that think that there are no moral facts. That's error theory. So error theorists are, and this is something I think Matt Lutz gives this example, but he compares error theory to atheism. So error theory is the position that, hey, when people go around saying stuff like, murder is wrong, they're trying to refer to these stance-independent moral facts, but there aren't any. So error theory agrees with moral realists about what people are doing when they make moral claims. They're trying to refer to these objective moral facts, but there just aren't any facts of that kind. So what people are doing is systematically saying false things. They're just in error. It would be the same as if someone went around saying God wills this, God wills that, God wills this. If there is no God, all of those statements are false. So error theory holds what might sound like a strange position, which is that all of our ordinary moral claims are false. So that's error theory. And then finally, you have non-cognitivism, which really we should update the terminology here because non-cognitivism is a pretty old school position. But non-cognitivism holds that when people make moral claims, like murder is wrong, it's not even the purpose of what they're saying to make propositional claims about what's true or false. Instead, they're expressing some type of non-propositional content that could not be true or false in principle. So the standard classic positions would be emotivism and prescriptivism. So emotivism would treat murder as wrong as something like murder boo, and prescriptivism would treat it as something like don't murder. Now, note, like if someone says shut the door, that can't be true or false. And the same thing with don't murder can't be true or false. So that's your classical non-cognitivist positions, which are championed on the emotivist side by A.J. Ayer. And then for universal prescriptivism, I'm leaving out some features of Ayer's position, but R.M. Ayer was a proponent of prescriptivism. Those positions gradually receded in response to just this avalanche of sort of semantic objections and embedding objections. Basically, people saying, look, the way, if you look at the structure of the way moral claims work in everyday language, it really doesn't look like they're serving those non-propositional roles. It looks like they have this propositional content to them. So the contemporary position no longer tends to call itself non-cognitivism, but it's the sort of it's the offspring of non-cognitivism, which is expressivism. And expressivists tend to retain this view that the primary or central function of moral discourse is fundamentally expressive. It's not about asserting propositions, but what they want to do is they want to vindicate or justify the perception that we have, the appearance that ordinary language does look like it functions in this truth operational way. And so they sort of bring together this grab bag of various gizmos and gadgets, philosophically speaking, to create this really sophisticated position. They often bring in like a deflationary account of truth. They often bring in something called projectivism. So they bring in a host of characteristics to try to accommodate you could say the objective or realist seeming features of ordinary discourse without fully embracing the metaphysics of discourse, of realist discourse. That was probably like a little too complicated, but that's the contemporary landscape.
It's expressivism is definitely its own beast. Simon Blackburn is still broadly an expressivist about this kind of thing. It's been a while since I've read his work, but he certainly was at some point. This is again a very complex position to hold.
Oh, it's closed the gap between realism and anti-realism so much that there are now disputes about, is it really a type of anti-realism? So some people have said, oh, come on, you're basically realists. And I think some expressivists have jumped ship and said, fine, I'm a realist.
Yeah, it does. There is this curious phenomenon that sometimes happens between just generally people who are very deflationary about truth and people who are hardcore correspondence theorists about truth, where they kind of horseshoe rounds and eventually they both end up saying, well, maybe we're saying the same thing. To which I think the deflationary theorists can say, yes, we are. You've just got a bunch of extra stuff that you're talking about that you don't need. But I'm not really sure the correspondence theorists can quite do the same thing. But anyway, let's zoom in a little bit on moral relativism, because I don't think that I'm exaggerating much when I say that this is possibly one of the most strawmanned and misunderstood philosophical positions out there. And this is something you've spoken quite a lot about. So what are the kind of things that people think when they hear moral relativism? And what are the kind of things that moral relativists are actually trying to say when they talk about moral relativism?
Yeah, it is of the three main anti-realist positions by far the most recognized and the most maligned. It's hated so much. The Phil Paper survey, which is a big survey of philosophers, when it included a metaethics question, it didn't even include relativism as an option. So the view in any straightforward form is not popular among analytic philosophers. So relativism. So I think, and this would be a question you have to do research on to figure out what people really think. Of course, I always say stuff like that. But very roughly, when people hear relativism, they often associate relativism not specifically with morality, and often it isn't associated with it. There is a sort of general sense of relativism that people often endorse, which is relativism about truth or relativism in a broader sense. But it's often viewed, and in many cases correctly so, as this sort of wishy-washy attitude that people adopt when they're a fence sitter. They don't want to take a stance on things. They want to broadcast or signal their intellectual or cultural sophistication, that I'm cosmopolitan, I'm open-minded, I'm tolerant. And so it's often an easy view for people in certain social contexts to fall into this sort of caricature of popular relativism, which seems to serve a lot of social functions of signaling, at least in that context, what the person perceives to be desirable qualities about themselves. That isn't to say people aren't sincerely endorsing relativism, but that at least is the popular perception of it. And part of that is this perception that it fosters a kind of moral complacency and a sort of disinterest in, or even hostility or opposition to, interfering to prevent crises and moral atrocities abroad. So, your typical case would be someone saying, hey, there's like a genocide going on in this country. We need to help the people somehow. And then the relativists would say, well, but it's their culture and you can't judge other people's culture. That's the popular perception of relativists. And it's not a flattering one. And insofar as people do have that disposition, I'm all on board with saying, yeah, I'm not cool with that. I'm not cool with people saying, I'm a relativist, so I don't care if people get slaughtered if they're on the other side of a border from me, or even within the same border. So that's the popular perception. But relativism as a view within philosophy, you have to disambiguate all these different components of it. So it would be just as inappropriate to say Christianity is false because I could go out and find a bunch of Christians that have really confused theologies or don't understand. If I go find a random Christian on the street, they're not going to be able to easily articulate what the Trinity is or transubstantiation or defend Christian doctrine effectively under most circumstances. Maybe, sometimes random people study a lot, but a lot of them are just, it's going to sound like a mess. Now, does that show Christianity is false? No. Likewise, the fact that I could go find like a college freshman that has some inchoate view of relativism and it ends up being this incoherent mess, it doesn't mean that there isn't a defensible core to the philosophical position within metaethics. So the first thing to say is we need to distinguish relativism, metaethical relativism, from some other common things it's confused with. So metaethical relativism is the view that moral truths contain an implicit indexical element such that their truth status can vary based on which standard they're indexed to. Now, that sounds really fancy and complicated, probably, but we actually use indexes all the time. Words like I, me, you. So if I say, I am Lance, it's true. If you say it, unless secretly your name is Lance, it's going to be false. So that word I is functioning as an indexical. And what does that mean? It means that the meaning of what the term refers to varies depending on the context in which it's used. When I use it, it refers to me. And when anybody else uses the word I, it refers to them. And the same thing with like a word like that. So if I point at a tree and say that's a tree, the statement is true. If I point at like a rock and say that's a tree, the statement's false. So the same exact statement, that's a tree, can be true if you point at a tree and false if you point at a rock. I'd say that, the word that there is functioning as an indexical. So sometimes indexicals aren't explicitly articulated. So if I take a bite of cake and it's really delicious, it would be a little weird for me to say, I find this cake delicious. That's weird. That's a little too formal. I'm going to say, this is freaking delicious. Now, am I saying this cake instantiates the property of intrinsic deliciousness? I could, but if you ask me what I mean, I'm going to go, no, I'm telling you how I experience cake. If you took a bite and you said it's gross, I'd say, all right, well, different people have different taste preferences. So you are reporting, at least a lot of us would be reporting something about our own preferences, but we're not saying it's about our preferences. So it's implicit. So relativism treats moral claims like that. It's just when you say something like stealing is wrong, it means something like, I don't approve of stealing, or stealing is inconsistent with my moral standards, or my culture disapproves of stealing, something like that. And as you could see, if one person says my culture disapproves of stealing and their culture does, it's true. And if another person says my culture disapproves of stealing and their culture doesn't disapprove of stealing, it's false. So the same statement could be true when some people say, false when others say it. That is relativism, or at least metaethical relativism. And this is mixed up with a couple other positions. And I'll pause after mentioning this distinction. Sometimes people mix it up with the descriptive or empirical observation that different people have different moral standards. So people will say stuff like, but different people have different moral values. So moral relativism. Okay, but different people have different views about the shape of the earth. It doesn't mean relativism about the shape of the earth. Some people are wrong. And some people mix it up with this normative attitude, which is you have to tolerate or respect other people and other cultures with different values from your own. That's a normative position. It's a substantive position on what's right or wrong. It's not a metaethical position. So metaethical relativism is a position on what makes moral claims true. It's not a position on who you have to tolerate or respect, and it's not a position on the empirical observation of moral diversity. Okay, I said a lot there, so I'll pause.
No, absolutely. I think that indexical point's very, very important. And just generally, when I've tried to talk about this before, I've used language as an example. This idea that the reference of particular terms are fixed by context, and actually that is a perfectly everyday thing. We shouldn't feel that that's particularly unusual or particularly out there. Contextual fixing of reference is completely ubiquitous in the way that we use language. And indexicals are a very obvious example of that. But and as you say, the taste is another way of kind of getting at this. And on the taste point, a lot of people hear a comparison between taste and morality, and they think something like, oh, I don't know if that quite... There seems to be certain disanalogies between taste and morality that feel like they're very important to bring out. For example, when you say cake, if we are sharing the same cake and you say this cake is delicious and I say this cake's not delicious, it doesn't seem like we are entangled in any kind of disagreement. At the very least, I'm not going to, as a matter of behavior, have a problem with you eating the cake and enjoying the cake, and you're not going to have a problem with me not eating the cake or eating the cake and not enjoying it if I make that bizarre decision. Whereas when we have moral disagreements, we tend to be significantly more bullish about them, let's say. For example, it seems like the scope of my moral claim is broader than my taste claims generally. When I say killing babies is wrong, which, I do think is a preference claim ultimately, I'm not just using that preference claim to govern me. I'm attempting to govern everyone else with that claim as well. I'm going to have a problem if other people start doing it. And I think that a lot of people take this as an argument against moral relativism. I tend to think that it's not, for a variety of reasons, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I've addressed this myself, and I've come up with a couple sort of dialectical tools for dealing with this sort of objection. So sometimes if you use analogies to food or music or other sorts of preferences, people will say stuff like, well, you can't compare morality to food preferences. Food preferences are arbitrary, they're unimportant, and they only apply to you. You wouldn't impose your food preferences on others. And that's all true. But I dubbed a term for this, which I call the overcomparison fallacy. And so the overcomparison fallacy occurs whenever you are comparing two things with respect to one or more characteristics, but people mistakenly infer that you're comparing them with respect to other characteristics. So an example I like to give is if I say, hey, the sun is yellow and this lemon is yellow, someone could say, well, you can't compare those. The sun is much bigger and hotter and important than a lemon. Okay, but I'm not comparing them with respect to those characteristics. I'm comparing them with respect to their color. Now, I don't think the sun is actually yellow. I think it has to do with like light refraction. I think it's white or something. But assuming the sun is yellow, okay, well, they share that trait in common. They're both yellow. That's the only point of the comparison. When a relativist is comparing moral claims to food preference claims, they're not comparing them in any other respect, or at least they don't have to be. They're just saying, hey, moral claims are made true by our preferences or our desires. So are our food preference claims. So this cake is good is made true by the fact that I like the cake. And murder is wrong is made true by the fact that I disapprove of murder. They are not comparing them in any other respects. So they're not saying my moral claims are equally as arbitrary or unimportant to me as my taste preferences. So they could have sort of meta preferences. I don't want my moral values to change. I don't want to suddenly be someone that's okay with like torturing babies. But if someone said, hey, we're going to change your food preferences, so now you like chocolate ice cream more than vanilla ice cream, I might say, okay, I don't really care that much. There might be circumstances in which I would care. I don't think I want to start liking music I currently hate. But it's not that big of a deal. So one way in which they vary is that moral standards are often a much greater importance to us than our food preferences. But I never said they're equally important as one another. I just said that they're both be true by our desires. And same thing for scope, which you mentioned. So sometimes people will be puzzled by the comparison because they'll say things like, well, you wouldn't impose your food preferences on other people. True, I wouldn't, but I would impose my moral standards on other people. I will vote for laws to prohibit people from torture anywhere in the world. It doesn't have to be around me. I don't want anybody to torture. Well, so you can have preferences about your own conduct and you don't care about I don't have preferences that other people wear the same clothing as me. I don't care what they wear. But I do have preferences about what other people do in other circumstances. For instance, I have a preference when people are driving that they not randomly swerve into my lane, or they not drink a whole bunch of alcohol, or they not turn their lights off in the middle of the night. Why? Because it impacts me. What they eat or what they wear doesn't impact me, but what they do, if it endangers me or my family or the people I care about, does impact me. So, there's a natural explanation for why people that are relativists would care about people's conduct in a moral context and not care about it in a food context. It impacts them and it interferes with their values. And it doesn't even have to impact me. I don't want people like torturing each other in other countries. I don't want that to happen. So it doesn't have to directly impact me. I'm still against it. So moral values can be true depending on our preferences. And those preferences could be universal in scope. You could have a preference that nobody does a particular thing, and they could be very important to you. People just seem to think, if you're comparing things in terms of them both being matters of preference, that you're thinking that they're also similar in every other respect. That doesn't follow. So this is just a mistake that critics of relativism make.
I've sometimes tried to, as a kind of pedagogical tool, try to think about it as imagining the future that you desire. And the future that you desire when you have a food preference is that you eat something and you're kind of indifferent to what everyone else eats. But the future you desire when it comes to morality is a future that other people can, if they have moral disagreements with you, substantively alter. like I sometimes think about it as okay, imagine that food preferences had a similar kind of incursion on your world. Like it wasn't, it wasn't that people could eat different foods. Everyone had to eat the same food through some mystical law. Well, then we might feel just as then the scope of our food preferences would expand to encompass everyone's choices of food, because all of a sudden, all of these causal relationships would be there that weren't there before. And it seems like morality is almost analogous to that. I don't know whether that's sometimes helpful. I sometimes use it as a way to try and bridge the divide. Imagine that your food preferences it really did make sense to care about them on the same scope as your moral preferences.
It's a fantastic comparison. Yeah, look, some people hate eating fish, or they're vegans and they don't want to eat animal products. If we all get the same rations, we're all doled out exactly the same food, those people are going to fight or argue aggressively. I don't want that, and I want. They might want to compromise, or they might want to impose their own food preferences on others. Same thing with music. There's certain music I don't like. Like, I'm not a big fan of country music. If Spotify said, all right, we're only going to play one genre of music from now on, people would, it's not just me, people would be violently in favor of making sure that their preferred genre of music was the top choice. So, the moment that other people's actions influence us, we start caring about them. And if it really was the case, and there is actually a limited extent in which other people's preferences do impinge on us. If certain music trends or food trends get really, really popular, it can crowd out the availability of your own preferences. If nobody liked the same food as me, I wouldn't be able to find it in a store. There wouldn't be any restaurants that cater to my preferences, and that would be a bummer. It's the same thing for art. I don't. So at least one point I've made is that I actually think that the concern that we have actually come together from both ends. So on the one hand, people actually do to some extent care about the kind of architecture in their society, the kind of art that they see, the kind of cultural products that their society puts forward, even if they don't think that there's a stance-independent fact about what's actually good or bad. It's just a matter of preference. And on the flip side, I think that philosophers often overestimate the degree to which people are actually that concerned about every single moral issue. Lots of people have the attitude that, look, I don't approve of this action, but if you're going to do it, go ahead. I think it's morally wrong, but I'm not going to stop you. And a lot of people just don't moralize and are not as self-righteous and not as concerned about morality as I think philosophers often construe morality as this like central thing that everybody cares about all the time. Talk to students. Students, morality is a part of life, but it's not the center of life. And philosophers treat it that way. And it's really, for many people, I don't think that it is. So you get this convergence from both ends, both that people are to some extent concerned about other people's preferences, and they're not that concerned about at least some aspects of other people's moral conduct.
So there's no longer this hard line that can be drawn between aesthetic preferences, let's say, just for the sake of having a label, and moral preferences. They seem to exhibit much more of the same behavior than we tend to give them credit for. I think that something that people will quite often say, and it's become almost so popular, it's happened in a couple of debates I've been in actually, where someone will make the claim that most people in practice are robust moral realists. And I sometimes struggle to pass this because I'm not entirely sure how a robust moral realist behavior would differ from a moral anti-realist of any stripe within kind of metaethical positions. What kind of research is there on whether people are moral realists in any sense, and what difficulties do we encounter when we're trying to ascertain whether in someone's kind of folk metaethical positions they are a moral realist or a moral relativist or an expressivist or what have you?
So most of the research on this topic only goes back about 20 years. I won't get into the whole history of it, which is of interest to me because my main area of research is the methods used to assess whether or not non-philosophers, people without a bunch of formal training in philosophy, whether or not they're moral realists. That's a big question, and moral realists frequently leverage the claim that most people are moral realists to argue for a presumption in favor of realism. And this can be finessed a bit. There's a bit of nuance to it. So there are questions about when you say most people are realists, are you saying most people believe realism? Are you saying that the way that people speak or the way that they think exhibits an implicit commitment to realism? Are you saying it's a sort of feature built into the semantics of our language, independent of any factors of human psychology? There's a variety of ways in which you could frame it. But very roughly, it's the view that people tend to speak, think, and act like realists, and sometimes people will say that we experience morality, like the phenomenology of morality has a kind of realist quality to it. The way that, like, when I see trees, it seems like trees are out there. They don't seem like they're part of my preferences. And so the claim is that when people experience morality, it's experienced as this thing imposed from the outside. We don't experience it the way we would experience, take a bite of cake, it tastes, take a bite of cake, tastes good. And you're like, yeah, it's my preference. It tastes good to me. But that we experience morality in a way where it's out there, kind of like trees in a way. It doesn't have to, not a physical sense, but it's not made true by our attitudes or preferences. So phenomenology, implicit feature of the way that we speak, implicit feature of the way that we think. It might be built into the structure of our language. There's a variety of different claims. Now, the empirical evidence on this, again, is fairly new, but the main method that initially emerged is what's called the disagreement paradigm. And so what researchers did, and researchers are a combination of philosophers and psychologists, and they've both been involved in various ways. What they do is they basically take either you and another person or two other people. And I'll give an example of the second one because it's simpler. Let's say we have these two people, Alex and Sam. Alex thinks third trimester abortions are morally wrong. Sam thinks third trimester abortions are not morally wrong. And then participants are presented with a scenario and asked, do you think Alex and Sam can both be correct? Or do you think at least one of them must be incorrect? And if they say they could both be correct, that's judged as a sort of non-realist position, because what they're saying is that two conflicting positions can both be true at the same time. That implies maybe something like relativism. Conversely, if you say at least one of them must be incorrect, that implies a kind of realist position because it's suggesting that you think there can only be one correct answer. And so answers wouldn't be true just because someone thinks that they're true or someone holds that value. So that's the primary tool. Now, what did that find? It found something really weird. What they found is that if you give people different moral issues, if you give them abortion, it's going to be like a 50-50 split. A lot of people pick the anti-realist response option. But if you give somebody something really extreme and awful, like someone just shooting a bunch of people for no good reason or no apparent reason, then most people will tend to say that at least one, if someone thinks that that's acceptable, that person's wrong. Now, what that seems to show is what researchers called metaethical pluralism, that people appear to give a realist response to some issues and an anti-realist response to others. And so it looks like people have this mixed position. And you might interpret that as, okay, well, people are realists because all it takes to be a realist is you're realist about at least one issue. There's a big problem with this research. And that big problem, myself and others started looking at the methods used in these studies. So there's a variety of people involved: Thomas Polzler, James Beebe, Jennifer Wright, a lot of people that have done important research on this, my colleague David Moss. But what David and I did is we started looking at the question, well, how are the participants in these studies interpreting what they're being asked? And what David and I found is that they are not primarily interpreting this disagreement question as a question about metaethics. So if you look at the kinds of responses people give, we did see one funny response, which is the participants were told, first they're asked, like, what is your position on the matter? And then they're told, a previous participant holds a contrary position. Do you think you and the other participant could both be correct? Or is at least one of you incorrect? And for the case of a person like opening fire with a gun into a crowd of people, one person just said, well, they just misread the question, which I thought was a brilliant response.
I mean, that does make sense as well, because, if I was presented with something like that and I was told, oh yeah, the person before you thought this was right, I would just think, hang on a sec, I have a set of experiences where I know that moral opinions in fact diverge, and somebody just shooting a bunch of innocent people for no reason, or was it the classic philosophical example of killing puppies for fun? I just know that that's the kind of thing. It becomes more plausible to interpret that situation as evidence that something weird has gone on in the whole question answering thing than to say, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. There was someone before me who believed that killing puppies for fun was okay. And I disagree, but that's the kind of thing that happens in our everyday life.
Yep. Yeah. So it's a completely reasonable response. Other responses is, and think about that scenario. So you're told another person thinks it's okay to shoot at a crowd of people. A more common response, I only recall one person saying that. There might have been more. But a more common response was something like, well, the other person must have been thinking of some context or scenario in which the action would have been permissible. Maybe it's a war. Maybe they're trying to stop terrorists. I don't know. So in those cases, what they're doing is they're thinking, okay, well, I'm thinking of an issue where this category of action would be wrong, and they're thinking of some other issue, some different context where that same type of action would be right. So I say, you ask me, is stealing wrong? And I go, yeah. And you say, okay, well, what about if someone was stealing to save their grandma? Okay, well, now it's okay. Now all else being equal, that's okay. So you would do this, say, oh, so you're not against stealing? no, it depends. But the answer, it depends, is not relativism. That's just the view that categories of action types can vary in whether they're morally right or wrong depending on the context. It's consistent with any metaethical position. So that was a huge number of people. A lot of people just go, well, the other person's a jerk. I don't like that person. Is that a metaethical? Do they have a metaethical position or not? I can't tell at that point. So what David and I did is we coded that data, and then my research, I gathered like a bunch of data sets, some from other people, at least a dozen of my own. And I asked in a variety of different sorts of ways, what do you think this question is asking you? Why did you answer the question this way? I directly asked people, what do you think it means to say morality is objective? What do you mean? What do you think it means to say it's relative? I gave them a variety of questions used on surveys that are intended to figure out if people are relativists or not. All this stuff. And I asked people, what is this question asking you? What does this response to the question mean? And I give them a very clear articulation of a realist or relativist position. And across all of that, I coded it for, did the participant exhibit a clearly intended interpretation in line with researcher intent? In other words, did they interpret a question about relativism as a question about relativism or not? And what I found across every one of these studies is that in the vast majority of cases, the answer is either no, they clearly interpreted it in some unintended way, or you can't tell. And so there is a bunch of research on this question. But what I argue in my work is this research is inconclusive. We just don't know because most people are not interpreting the questions the way researchers intend. So I could give you the whole rundown of what that research shows. But since I think it's inconclusive, I almost think it's a waste of time. And I feel very bad saying that because a lot of the research is really innovative. It's really cool research, but I just don't think it's very conclusive. Now, the reason I propose for why that is not just, people don't understand the questions. I actually think there's a reason why people are struggling to interpret these questions the way researchers intend. I think it's because they don't have views about metaethics at all. And so you're asking people that don't have training about a topic that they've never considered before, and there's not enough context for them to even know what you could be asking. So I actually ran a kind of a satirical study to illustrate how this problem of asking people questions about topics they couldn't possibly have a position on could give the misleading impression that they actually do have a position. So what I did is I took a bunch of people, I asked them if they had training in quantum mechanics or they studied physics or anything like that. And I set those people, like they were still in the study, but you could isolate them and set them aside from the analysis if you want. And then what I did is I said, look, do you have a position on how to interpret quantum mechanics, like Copenhagen, many worlds? People say no. Then I give them a basic rundown of the positions and I ask them, okay, what do you favor, Copenhagen or many worlds? And I jokingly note 100% of people picked one of those responses. So if I were an unscrupulous researcher, I could then say, look, 70% of people endorse the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. Ordinary people have a view about quantum mechanics. But I then asked them, did you feel compelled to choose a response option even though it didn't actually reflect what you think? And about 50% of them said yes. So already that's a problem. So look what I did. It'd be like the same as if I asked you, what's your favorite fruit, apples or bananas? Well, if those aren't one of your favorite fruits, how are you supposed to answer the question? You have no choice but to pick one. Now, that case, you actually know what I'm asking you. But in this case, is it plausible at all that a one-paragraph summary written by me is going to get people to understand quantum mechanics? No, I don't understand quantum mechanics. There's no way that they have a clear enough sense of quantum mechanics to know whether they could settle on the Copenhagen or many worlds. But 100% of them chose a response. And this is a win-win for me because half of them, they chose a response that they said, this isn't my view. You didn't give me any other options. It was a forced choice. The other half, okay, well, they just said 5 seconds before this that they didn't have a view on the matter. So what that means is that they apparently formed a view on the matter in the middle of the study. Now, see the problem here. If my goal in the research is to find out how do people without training in quantum mechanics think about quantum mechanics, I can't train them in quantum mechanics. And then I either fail, in which case their answers are still irrelevant because they don't know what I'm asking them, or they succeed, in which case they don't represent the population they came from because now they have adequate training. So you can't study the topic if people don't understand the questions. And your goal is to figure out, like, in other words, you cannot study how untrained people think about a topic that they couldn't understand unless they had training.
Exactly. Everyone listening to this podcast would now be disqualified from such a study. Some of them are
going to have training.
It's interesting to think about this. It reminds me a lot of just generally when we are eliciting verbal reports from people in any kind of study context. There's a whole background of cooperative principles that we just do when we talk to anyone that, at least in my views, just seem to hum away in the background, right? So, like a classic one is I can't remember the exact. It was one of those It's actually, this observation is slightly inspired by a sketch from Yes Minister, but it is actually borne out by various political polls, is that oftentimes a huge distortive influence in polling is the wish from the person being polled to cooperate with the pollster. It's just kind of, and that's not because they're sycophantic, it's just because linguistic understanding seems to operate on this bedrock of kind of generally assuming that we're all trying to make one another understood and trying to, rub along in a cognitive sense, at least as far as I can tell. And it seems like this interferes a lot with generally asking people direct responses on various different things.
Yeah, this is absolutely the case. And this is a common problem in psychological research. Now, it's going to be less of a problem for straightforward measures where people understand what they're doing. But the moment you give people ambiguous, complicated, or sophisticated things, they might very well do their best to answer the questions. But the problem is that studies are structured in ways where you basically bubble in a particular answer. And so if a person really doesn't understand what you're asking them or doesn't have a view on the matter, they're still going to bubble in an answer. And so it's going to look superficially like they have a position, even though they don't really have a position. And I actually think that, so within metaethics, what I conclude is there aren't a whole lot of people that endorse this position, but I call it folk metaethical indeterminacy, which is the view that generally speaking, majority of people just don't really have any particular view on metaethics. And I don't really think it's implicit in the way that they speak. You referenced this earlier, but if you look at the way everyday people act, the way they behave, the way they judge other people, the way they argue with one another, I don't think that a realist or an anti-realist analysis of what they're doing does a better job of explaining what they're up to than the alternative. And so one way to put it is their actions are underdetermined, and the way that they speak and think is underdetermined by the available evidence. Now, with more evidence, we might find some sort of a definitive answer as to whether they're implicit realists or implicit anti-realists. But I don't know what it would look like for a person to act like a realist or act like an anti-realist, because I think they would act pretty much the same way. So I don't know what realists are on about in particular when they say that people act like realists, but a lot of it is likely rooted in misunderstandings of the implications of anti-realism, and a big one being misunderstandings of relativism. Realists seem to think if you're an anti-realist, it's like weird for you to judge other people or care about what other people do. I don't agree. I don't think that it is. So a lot of what they take to be evidence of realism, I actually think is completely consistent with anti-realism.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that a lot of moral realists tend to say about anti-realism is that even if you hold moral preferences, they don't make sense. Like, why would they be compelling? And for me, at the very least, one of my general spin argument against robust realisms of a whole lot of kinds is that if something exists as an abstract fact somewhere off in, either the Platonic realm or the non-Platonic abstract realm, wherever we're putting this fact, in what way does that link up with my own motivation? You can come across this with questions of meaning as well. Is there an absolute stance-independent meaning of life? And it's like, well, if there is, it would have to interact with my stance in order for it to be motivational or compelling, at which point it seems like actually, or at least this appears to me to be something where it seems like it's a critique of moral anti-realisms, but it is, in some sense, seems more fit as a critique of moral realism. It seems like, at the very least, whereas under any kind of analysis of moral beliefs that bottoms out in preferences, like stance-dependent preferences, seems to have a very, very straightforward causal route from those preferences to how people behave, because we already, I take it as uncontroversial that preferences affect how people behave. That seems, if we can agree on anything, it seems like we can agree on that. Whereas this idea of stance-independent moral facts affecting how someone behaves, it seems like a significantly more difficult story to tell. And this is where my knowledge kind of bottoms out. I just have that problem. How do moral realists attempt to bridge that gap?
Well, some of them don't attempt to bridge the gap. They would just be externalist about motivation, and they'll just say, look, there's moral facts, take them or leave them. So some of them are just going to stop there. As far as how they try to bridge that gap in other cases, I'm not entirely sure. So I've tried talking to realists about this, and at least one of the things that they might say, because, you might give people a hypothetical, you might give realists a hypothetical, which is, what if the moral facts, it turns out these stance-independent moral facts are radically at odds with what you think is right or wrong, what your gut tells you. So it turns out, for instance, you just got to torture babies. It's obligatory. What realists have told me in various situations is some of them just say that's impossible. The moral facts are necessary. But okay, what if it's a necessary moral fact that you got to torture babies? I don't know why that's off the table. They might say that at least some basic moral facts are self-evident, or they're so obvious that it's an unreasonable question. It'd be a bit like asking someone, okay, but what if squares had 7 sides? It's just not a reasonable question. So they might say something like that. Uh, Others would say, well, you're posing a sort of underdeveloped hypothetical. So because of my views about how we would acquire moral knowledge, like via moral intuition and through this process of um, reasoning and getting into a state of reflective equilibrium, you could say, well, what if it turned out you had to torture babies? That was morally obligatory. Well, okay, what would that actually look like from a first person point of view as a realist? Well, it wouldn't just look like, oh, I guess I just got to torture babies. You would have to get into the state of mind where that ends up appearing to be consistent. Like, among other things, they might think, look, it's going to have to be consistent with all the other moral commitments that I take to be like platitudes or obvious or something like that. And so this would require a radical reorientation of my normative moral framework. What's it going to look like to get me there? Well, it's going to look like the standard thing that we do in philosophy, which is reason through the arguments, get into a state of reflective equilibrium. And that's going to be such a complicated, stepwise series of philosophical disputes that, okay, maybe if I went through that whole series of disputes, it would increasingly become the reasonable position. Just because I can't imagine what that would look like doesn't mean you've posed a reasonable question. And I think that there's some force to that response. So maybe I do have a better sense of what they would say. And I think that makes sense, because if someone asked me, do you think it's possible? Because, like, look, I'm going to endorse all these like pragmatic views and these, I'm not rigidly locked into this like hyper analytic approach to anything. So if someone said, is it possible that like you would abandon basic principles of logic or something like that, I might say yes. And then they say, okay, well, isn't the fact that you think it's even a possibility that you would have a radically different position than you have, that you don't think that your position on logic or other sorts of things is necessary, doesn't that commit you to thinking that you could find yourself in a really weird situation? Yeah, but I can't even conceive of what that would look like. And I think realists can pull the same move here. And I think pretty convincingly that trying to just get them with that one shot, like your One Punch Man, and what if baby torture? I think it's kind of right for them to say, yeah, but for that position to make sense against the backdrop of the rest of my beliefs and commitments, there would have to be so many pieces shifted and moved around that you might even think is reasonable at that point. And maybe it would. I don't know. Does that make sense?
I remember. No, that does make sense. The logic comparison is very helpful actually, because I sometimes reflect, after reading Graham Priest, sort of what would it take for me to abandon the law of non-contradiction? Like, what would it actually mean, for me to say, no, right, this isn't the primary, or this isn't one of the primary logical rules I'm going to use to engage with the world. I'm going to have to adopt some kind of paraconsistent system. And it is very hard to come up with, but at the same time, it is conceivable, as it was. And I can think, I can accept that as a possibility. And I can also see how radical that possibility might be. So yeah, it'll be interesting to touch on this point of moral intuitions, because I did a video a while ago on anti-natalism as a kind of normative ethical stance. And I ended up sort of getting to the bottom of reading a whole bunch of anti-natalist texts and reading a whole bunch of anti-natalist texts, and sort of saying it seems like we've bottomed out at two moral intuitions that just hit up against one another. We've reached some kind of ethical bedrock, which of course begs the question, what are these intuitions? And where do they come from? What stock ought we to put in them epistemically? And how do we even begin to start resolving what seem at glance to be irresoluble bedrock intuitive disagreements?
Yeah. Is there a question in there? I mean, I agree.
Oh, sorry.
I think there's a problem there.
I suppose. Yeah. Well, let's start with the first one. In the methodology of, when people are arguing for different metaethical positions and then furthermore different ethical positions, these intuitions are often appealed to. We're both quite skeptical of them, and you know much more about it than I do. So I'm going to request that perhaps you'd say a bit about what those are, but also maybe attempt to steelman them, because as I don't know enough about them to really steelman them.
It's an area where I feel like I don't really know enough either. There is a surprisingly large literature on intuitions and what they are and how they work and all that stuff. I I haven't dug into it recently. This is something I dug into back over a decade ago, and I found it super fascinating. But then my interest shifted towards metaethics, and I'm slowly returning to this question of intuition. And it feels like the buzz around that question has died down. I don't see too many people really getting into what are intuitions and how they work. But one of the first things you'll discover if you look into the philosophical literature, what you could call meta-philosophy, like philosophy of philosophy, like what are intuitions, what role do they play in philosophy, is that these questions are unresolved. So you have people come out swinging with really strong cases. So you have Herman Capellan wrote this book, Philosophy Without Intuitions. And what he argues isn't that we shouldn't use intuitions in philosophy, but that as a matter of historical and contemporary fact, for the most part, we don't use intuitions in philosophy, which is a really seemingly radical position that I think when you look at what he has to say, it's a lot more compelling than it might initially seem. I think a lot of philosophers immediately scoff at that and go, there's no way. That's like saying, engineers have nothing to do with building bridges. It would just sound bananas. But I think he makes a good case that a lot of what we would, you have to avoid anachronism, right? So it's easy to think, oh, Hume had the intuition that, or Kant finds it intuitive that. But if you look at how people phrased themselves, they rarely spoke in those ways. And importantly, and this is really important, even when people use that language, and language in philosophy, use of the term intuition is skyrocketed. But even when you look at the use of the word intuition in historical contexts, you still have to ask the question, what do they mean by intuition? And what dialectical role? In other words, what role is it serving in the arguments or the case that a philosopher is making? Is it actually serving an evidential role? Like proposition P is true because I have the intuition that P. And what Capellan argues is if you actually go back and carefully go through cases, you'll find surprisingly sparse evidence that people consistently used intuitions in the past as evidence. It certainly looks like people use them that way now because they say things like, I'm using intuitions as evidence, which is pretty good evidence that that's what they're trying to do. If I don't see how you get around that.
It's interesting you say that because I started a while ago to kind of, with my kind of people on the channel will know that I'm obsessed with polysemy and recognizing that words have different meanings in different contexts. And I started doing this with the word intuition because, of course, Kantian intuitions are incredibly different to what we mean now when we say intuitions. That kind of got me thinking. And it seems like there is this whole set of using the terms intuition and intuitive, some of which are this sort of more modern, it seems like it's true thing, where people say, it occurs to me like it's true, and this feeling in some sense is good evidence that it is true. Another is a generalization from anecdotal evidence, where somebody just says it's intuitive, and they mean something like, well, I've encountered lots of things like this in the past, and the best generalization from that experience is going to be that this one will follow as well. Another one is something like it's intuitive, meaning it is easier or better to use than alternatives. It's kind of a pragmatic framing. For example, I've seen people say things like, anti-realism, actually about metaethics, is more intuitive, meaning it's simpler, it contains fewer things, which is sort of a pragmatic methodological virtue, rather than saying that, I'm using this as truth-tracking evidence, let's say. I don't know. I think it's very interesting. It seems like this is one of those terms that, as you say, migrates a lot through time. But actually, even today, people seem to use intuitions or seemings, or just people say it seems to me, and they can mean a whole huge list of things like things using that term. And I do think it's the sort of more metaphysical heavyweight intuition talk that I struggle so much to understand. To bring this back a little bit to the role of disagreement in ethics. So you talked before about, in empirical studies, using disagreement as a kind of measure mark of moral realism. And even though in practice in those studies, that became unhelpful because of misunderstandings over terminology and the kind of inability to pass exactly what's being asked without kind of a requisite theoretical background, at which point you can't study people's pre-theoretic views on things, so it becomes very difficult. Nonetheless, what do you think is the role of disagreement in distinguishing different metaethical positions? It seems to me, at least, like it would be important, but I can't quite put my finger on why. It seems like there's a type of disagreement, namely truth-based disagreement, that would be evidence in favor of moral realism, or at least evidence in favor of the idea that a given person is a moral realist, but that it might be difficult to distinguish that from other forms of disagreement, such as, the kind of interest disagreement over the fact that we disagree on what a future state of the world we ought to work to bring about, which seems to me to be slightly different. Sorry, that was a kind of jumbled question, but I was wondering if you could say a little bit about the role of disagreement in just in the debate around moral realism. For instance, I've heard lots of people say that moral anti-realists struggle to accommodate disagreement, and then B, what its empirical role would be in attempting to survey and or study people's beliefs about metaethics, whether they're pre-theoretic or not.
Yeah, there's a lot going on with disagreement. So the funny thing about the sort of observation that people have moral disagreements, that people hold contrary positions to what's morally right or wrong, is that can be leveraged both as evidence for realism and against realism. So you could argue this is evidence of realism because if people were anti-realists, why would they go around having disputes about what's morally right or wrong? The people don't tend to argue about things for which they don't think that there's an objective or stance-independent fact of the matter. That would be one way of looking at it. But anti-realists have said, hey, wait a minute. The fact that there is so much disagreement and it seems to be persistent and intractable, that's actually evidence that either there are no moral facts for us to agree on, or there are no means available for us to agree on them. And so that either favors moral anti-realism, either that there are no facts of this kind, or at the very least moral skepticism, that if there are moral facts of this kind, we have no way of knowing about them. So both sides have appealed to disagreement to place human practices within their appropriate camp. But you draw a really good distinction there, which is a disagreement about truth and disagreements about, I don't know how you said interests, I think. I tend to phrase this as, look, there's disagreements about what's true, and there's disagreements about what to do. So I put it in a stupid, cutesy rhyme, hoping, that'll give it mimetic power. But when philosophers characterize disagreement, you have to be really careful, and I think they're often not careful about this, to disambiguate disagreement in a theoretical context, where what you mean by a disagreement is two or more individuals or points of view which hold contrary positions on the truth status of a proposition. So what you mean by disagreement in this context just is person A thinks statement X is true, person B thinks statement X is not true. If that's what you mean by a disagreement, then anti-realists are going to struggle a lot of the time to handle that type of scenario, because for at least some anti-realists, they're going to think, well, why would two people be arguing about this? One thinks it's like if I think chocolate cake is good and you think it's bad, what is there to argue about? I agree you think it's bad, and you agree I think it's good. What? There's no further argument to have. And so they might have trouble handling, which I say might, like maybe they have some ways of finessing that issue. But let's just grant that they have trouble accounting for that type of disagreement for the sake of argument. Okay, that's fine. Then the question is, so what realists might do is say, aha, see? So anti-realists can't make sense of disagreement because there's widespread moral disagreement. Anti-realists can't accommodate the data. The data is inconsistent with people being anti-realists. This is evident that people are actually some type of implicit realist. And so this is evidence of a presumption in favor of realism. But we have to ask the question, well, hold on. I agree with you that if you stipulate that what you mean by a disagreement is two or more individuals that hold contrary positions about the truth status of a proposition, okay, let's just agree for the sake of argument, anti-realists have trouble with that. When people are arguing in real life, is that in fact what's going on? Are they in fact disputing the truth of a proposition? It's not so clear that they are. And so I give comparisons of people arguing about things where it seems implausible that they have disagreements about factual matters, or that they appear to be arguing, even if it's not plausible that those people think that there's a stance-independent fact of the matter. Just take movie reviews, comments into the section for a trailer of a movie. This movie sucks. This movie doesn't suck. You're wrong. No, you're wrong. People argue about preferences all the time. People write reviews for Yelp and like food things. They write movie reviews. Are people realists about all of these things? I'm not so sure about that. So if, one thing realists about morality ought to do is acknowledge that evidence can overgeneralize. And so if your evidence suggests people are realists about morality, but that same evidence, if you generalize it, would suggest they're realists about a bunch of things that you don't think the realists about, that's a problem. And now you're going to need to account for that. And I don't think realists have done a good job. I haven't even seen any convincingly address this at all. Like, how do they account for that? They just don't seem to talk about it very much. So that's a problem. The other issue is that a lot of times people are arguing it's profoundly implausible that they have disputes about what's true. The example I like to give is, say you and a group of friends are going to order pizza. Well, different people always have different topping preferences. Somebody loves mushrooms, somebody hates them. Somebody's vegan, somebody's not vegan, whatever it is. And so your friends and you are trying to figure out what pizza toppings to get on a couple of pizzas you're ordering. Is there a fact of the matter about what pizza toppings you ought to get that's true independent of anybody's taste preferences? That seems ridiculous. That seems like an absurd notion. And yet people might argue about it. Well, we got mushrooms last time. Yeah, I know, but they're so good. And then, a third person goes, no, they're disgusting. And then the other person goes, yeah, but 5 of us like them. There's only one of you that doesn't like them. People argue like this. Now, are they arguing about what the facts are? No, they agree on what all the facts are. What they're doing in these cases is negotiating. They're trying to reach compromise. Another scenario I like to give is you go to a car dealership trying to buy a car. I want to pay the lowest price. The car dealership wants to charge the highest price. Are we car price realists? Do we think there's a fact of the matter about what the price of the car ought to be independent of the dealership or the seller or the buyer or anybody? And like the gods of cars are going to come down from the sky and say, no, the correct price. No, that's ridiculous. The correct price is whatever we're both mutually agree to. And so when we argue, I might point out, look, this car's got more miles on it than you initially said. It's got 3,000 more miles on it. And they might say, yes, but we just refurbished the car and I didn't even mention that. We got new tires on this thing. We got new brakes on this thing. And so we're both pointing to facts, but we're both pointing to facts in an effort to try to get one another to come to an agreement. That push is not an attempt to converge on what the correct price of the car is. It's just an attempt to appeal to our shared intersubjective goals. I want a car, you want money, let's come to an agreement. And this is why I say there's disagreements about what's true. There's also disagreements about what to do. And when we look at moral disputes, is it that the person outside an abortion clinic screaming that abortion is murder and we have to stop abortion? Is it that they must necessarily think it's the proposition abortion is wrong is true, and they just want the other person to go, yes, that's true? Or do they want them to not get abortions? I'm pretty sure it's the second one. Now, the only reason anyone would care about, in that context, the only reason it's plausible they would care about the person believing that abortion is wrong is insofar as it impacted the person's behavior. If they could convince the person to not get abortions without changing their beliefs about whether abortion is right or wrong, I think they'd prefer that. And so what are they actually trying to do? They're trying to change people's behavior, not their beliefs about what's true or false. And I think that's more plausible. So when realists look at disagreements and they construe them as disagreements about what's true, I don't think they're doing them being true would only be motivationally relevant if people cared about whether they were true or not. And people can care about doing things independent of whether they think they're true or not. So what do you need the truth for? So I think that the realist accounts of disagreement are actually explanatorily superfluous, that the only way they would work as an explanation is as a mediator, or if there's a middleman of human voluntary motivation. And the anti-realist account just dispenses with the disagreements about the beliefs and goes straight to motivation, just as you were pointing out earlier. Anti-realism it has a more parsimonious account of disagreement. So it's not just that I think it's neutral. If it came down to it, I would say, anti-realists do a better job of explaining people's behavior.
Yes, I think that when moral realists talk about things like, I don't think that anti-realists can facilitate moral disagreement or something like that, it strikes me that they sometimes are talking about that kind of like trying to describe human behavior. And at other times, they're trying to say something like, you have no grounds on which to disagree with somebody, outside of, let's, stick with immoral relativism, outside of your stance, your moral stance, be that your own individual moral stance or your society's moral stance. Because, if you intra-stance disagreement seems totally unproblematic, whatever metaethical position you're holding. But in terms of inter-stance moral disagreement, it seems like sometimes the moral realist point is that, okay, but you have no grounds on which to pull up another stance short and say, no, you're wrong, and I'm going to use this to justify my incursion upon your moral domain. And I again, it seems to me like the anti-realist response would naturally be to say something like, no, like the scope of my preferences include other stances, even though those stances aren't my own. But nonetheless, a lot of people, I think, find this very, very convincing, that there's this kind of underlying methodological assumption that a lot of people hold that in order to justify your own moral disagreement with another person, you must appeal to some kind of stance-independent perspective. What are the kind of responses you might give to that?
Yeah, I mean, the immediate response I like to give is just the counterfactual. So I just say to the realist, okay, well, suppose that there were no stance-independent moral facts, or suppose you came to believe that. Would you just stop opposing genocides and someone shows up and they're like, hey, I'm here to torture your kids. And you go, well, I don't have grounds for objecting, so I guess go ahead. No, still going to stop them. So if you get rid of realism, I think that the behavioral picture of the realist remains more or less completely intact. If there's any changes at all, I'd be surprised. Whereas for me, if you say, okay, well, now there are these objective moral facts, I'm going to ask the question, okay, well, do I care about them? Like, because so I act based on my desires, my goals. And sometimes people think when desires, they think that I'm saying I act egocentrically or I act only like I care about my family. I just had a daughter. I care a lot about my daughter. I would die for my daughter. So it's not, I don't put myself in the number one place. I'm an anti-realist. Does that, and I've had people tell me your life is meaningless. Nothing matters. No, my family matters to me. And if someone's saying, but they don't objectively matter, I don't care. I don't care about that. I'm not interested in that. So, there's an asymmetry here, which is, if the realist is wrong and their behavior doesn't change, there's something kind of funny about that. But for me, actually, I guess, I don't know if it's an asymmetry here. This isn't an asymmetry. I could point another asymmetry. Whereas if realism is true, I don't think my behavior would change. And so I don't know what the realism is doing. Like, it doesn't matter to me. So if a realism turns out to be true, it's not adding to the list of things I'm motivated to act on. And if you take it away, it's not removing anything people are motivated to act on. So what the heck is it doing from a motivational perspective? I think the answer is absolutely nothing. I think it can serve a sort of rhetorical function. It might make people feel better about their values. Maybe it feels better for me if I'm punishing people to think that like the universe approves of it, or, that's kind of a caricature of realism. I don't think they think the universe, they're not personifying it. If they're panpsychists too, maybe they are. So like, I don't think it matters very much. But there's another asymmetry here, which is that, this is something that you'll see if you look at stuff that Derek Parfit says or other realists say. Like, Parfit says stuff like, if I turn out to be wrong about realism, my life is a waste, nothing matters. There's like huge stakes in place for realists who think that without realism, life is meaningless and nothing matters. Whereas for me, I don't agree with that. If they're wrong, they think it's the worst possible outcome ever. Like, literally nothing matters. Whereas if I'm wrong, I'm going to be like embarrassed because I spent a long time arguing for anti-realism, and I would be really embarrassed. I'd be like, wow, I was really wrong for a long time. But it doesn't lead to my life being meaningless. So they have a lot to lose and I don't. And I do think that should give realists at least a little bit of pause, because, if all the stakes are on your side and not on my side, and you have a lot to lose, that could make people a bit more resistant to changing their mind than people on the flip side. So I think there's a couple things going on there. I don't know if that second part really addressed your concern, but I think the first one does.
Yeah, no, it touches upon something that I've been, again, this is just anecdotal experience. Whenever I ask, it seems like by far, well, maybe not by far, but the majority of philosophers I ask, if they work in a particular field, tend to be realists about the objects in that field. So, by far, the majority of ethicists that I speak to, like normative ethicists, tend to be metaethical realists. And quite a lot of philosophers of religion I talk to tend to be theists. And like quite a lot of philosophers of mathematics I talk to tend to be Platonists. And I sort of think, I don't know, given that I do think that at least, again, this is totally anecdotal, but I even feel the tug of, there's something very comforting at the very least about having even though I think that, if you were to ask me in cold mind, I would say that it's causally inert. There's still something comforting about me hooking my preferences or my beliefs or the thing that I'm studying onto something stable and out there and stance independent. And I sometimes wonder whether at least a plausible causal story about why philosophers end up being realists about or a lot of philosophers end up being realists about the particular objects of philosophy that they study might be because if they weren't realists about those objects, they might study another part of philosophy or not philosophy. It seems like there might be a kind of selection effect going on regarding the prevalence of realism in general. And I haven't tested that, but it's just it's just anecdotal.
Yeah, I think that there's something to that. At least some evidence that it's not a huge factor specifically in the case of moral realism is if you look at the Phil Paper survey, and what you'll find is in the 2020 Phil Paper survey, 62% of philosophers in general are moral realists, and if you focus just on specialists in metaethics, it only bumps up to 65%. So it doesn't go up by a
Okay.
huge degree. Whereas you get the opposite if you look at theism. So if you look at philosophers in general, very, very few are theists. I forget if it's 70%. I think it's 70% are atheists or 80% maybe. I
Yeah,
think
it's about
70%,
that, I think.
something like that. It's pretty high. And if you switch it to philosophy of religion, it flips. So you don't see that with metaethics. So
Right.
something interesting about that. But nevertheless, I do think that selection effects play both a general role in philosophy and they probably play at least some role in metaethics. A point I'll make about this, though, is that philosophers, or at least students and people online or whatever, just people, will sometimes appeal to these Phil Paper survey results and say, look, 62% of philosophers are moral realists. That's a majority. That's pretty good evidence of moral realism. But you have to ask about causality here. Now, if a lot of realists are right that most people are implicitly moral realists, what if it was, let's say, just for the sake of argument, it was 99% of people were moral realists. But then when they become philosophers, for some reason, it's only 62%. So that would seem to suggest that philosophy either attracts people that are more likely to be anti-realist than the general population, or that something about studying philosophy causes about a third of people to stop being realists and doesn't cause many anti-realists to become realists. How is that evidence of realism? That's actually evidence that I would look at that and go, here's an explanation. People have an overwhelmingly strong bias in favor of realism, and studying philosophy manages to partially curtail that very strong bias. That's equally consistent with the 62%. So I don't know why people just point to the majority. What they would have to show is that studying philosophy causes people to become moral realists, and they haven't shown that. So I don't, again, it's just ignored. But there's that, and there's more generally selection effects. And selection effects work in both directions. So selection effects can draw people in that are drawn towards the view, and they could drive people away that are not motivated to pursue philosophy in that way. But there's more. It's not just selection effects. It's not just like the barrier to entry, that what causes a person to step over the precipice and become a philosopher or not is driven by certain views that they have in advance. But also, once you're there, once you're an undergraduate, a graduate student, your early career, if you have a very critical or skeptical meta philosophy like I do, you get a lot of crap from people. People don't like it. People give you a hard time a lot. It can feel at times unwelcoming. Now, I don't want to give the impression that I'm like this big victim that is, oh, everybody's always mean to me. Most people are polite. Most people are cool. And most philosophers love to argue with people that have contrary views. And so you have people that actually want you around because they want someone to disagree with them. So you do get that, and you probably get more of that. But you will get people that make snipey, snarky comments on occasion. And I do think that can be a sort of sociologically relevant factor that drives people out of the field, especially people that don't have a thick skin. And I don't. I guess I'm just a masochist that gets insulted and I like it or something. I don't know. But people get driven out, I think, because they're made to feel unwelcome or like their point of view isn't well received.
And also, I suppose there's an element of, if you want a career as an academic philosopher, you have to get a lot of papers published, and that has to get through 2 reviewers. And if the reviewers really disagree with you, that's at least is going to be a hurdle. It might not be a decisive hurdle, but it is going to be a hurdle. Something you has studied quite recently has been this idea of signaling, kind of what somebody identifying as a moral relativist does socially. There's an interesting paper literally come out this year, Signaling Intolerance, Social Evaluation and Metaethical Relativism and Objectivism. I was just wondering if you might be interested in talking a little bit about what you did there and what you found.
I won't get into a lot of details about that because that study is pretty complicated. I will mention one thing that we did that I think more people should do. A lot of studies in metaethics actually keep just recycling the same set of moral issues that appeared in the first few studies. It's usually just like 10 random moral issues. But morality, in much the same way that when you're studying a population, you want your sample, like the people you study, to represent the population. You also want your stimuli to represent the domain that you're studying. So one of the things that we pushed for in that study was to not just recycle the same random set of moral issues. Because imagine I gave you these as the only relevant moral issues. Lying, cheating on your taxes, like misreporting things on your taxes, and fraud. Okay, well, they're all kind of related to like deception. So is deception representative of the entire moral, body of potential issues? No, there's questions of loyalty, questions of harm, questions of fairness, and you wouldn't be covering any of those. And so if there are systematic differences in how people, or at least people in your sample, think about matters of deception versus those other matters, you're going to overlook those. And so you need the items in your sample to be representative of the domain. So at least one of the things that we did to try to improve on that is we used a much broader set of moral issues. I think we used 44 in a couple of the studies. There's particular reasons for why we did that, with making sure that everybody gets an even number of them. But anyway, so we used a lot of moral issues and we pre-tested them to make sure that they covered a broader range of moral issues. But what we were looking at in there, and it's a little complicated to get into the specifics, but we were looking at when a person expresses a metaethical position towards their moral position, whether they express like relativism or objectivism, or you could say realism. So relativism or realism. I think we use the term objectivism in the paper. Sorry, people are so inconsistent with terminology. Okay, so when a person expresses that view, and then another person is looking at that person and judging that person, what do I like this person? Are they trustworthy? Would I want them as a roommate? Any of those sorts of signals of the person's character. It matters both the metaethical stance that the person takes and the metaethical stance that the person appraising them takes. And so those interact with one another in really complicated ways. So it's not the case that people generally just positively perceive a person adopting a relativist stance or an objectivist stance. Whether or not they would prefer that the person adopt an objectivist or a relativist stance depends on their own metaethical stance and on the issue in question. So, for instance, just to give a very crude example, if I'm a relativist about abortion, I'd prefer you being a relativist about abortion. But if you and I, if I'm an objectivist about it, I might prefer that you be an objectivist about it. But there might be circumstances where, depending on the issue, I would actually prefer that you hold a contrary metaethical position as well. It might just depend on the issue. So the specifics are so specific that it would be hard for me to recall an exact example or detail. I'd have to point to one and go, here it is. But I don't recall off the top of my head the specific examples. But yeah, basically what you get is a really interesting interaction between the metaethical positions of the people judging and the people being judged. And one of the things that this does indicate is that people seem to pick up on and be receptive to what their metaethical stance broadcasts about their character. And that's a really important thing, because it may be a relevant factor in what people say when they're asked questions about metaethics. And that could mislead researchers into thinking that people hold metaethical positions that they don't really hold. And it could also mean that the metaethical positions that people express or adopt serve a different function than we might think. So a lot of times when we think about people's philosophical positions, or the positions that they at least express or claim to have in a particular context, we think of it merely as a matter of people just trying to assert what's true, that people are just saying, look, here's my point of view. But it's entirely possible that, and in fact, I think quite plausible, that a lot of what we say and the way that we frame things, including our metaethical positions, can be motivated by our argumentative or social goals. So when I take up, if I'm trying to convince people, okay, let me give a couple contexts to make sense of this. I'm trying to convince a group of people. I'm a leader. I'm trying to convince a group of people we're going to, get active and go oppose something. Am I going to say I'm a relativist about the issue or an objectivist about the issue? And what do you think?
Well, I imagine an objectivist, just because it seems
Yeah,
more
because
rhetorically sound.
you want them to think this is true. Yeah, get pumped up.
Yeah.
But if I'm trying to get people to see me as a tolerant and respectful person, I'm going to adopt a relativist stance towards the issue. And so this raises a possibility that much of the ordinary language that philosophers take as data about whether people are realists or relativists is actually better construed as data about people adopting relativist sounding language and realist sounding language for the social and argumentative purposes that it achieves. In other words, like they adopt the language because it's useful in persuading people, or they adopt the language because it signals positive qualities about them in the appropriate context. And the reason that people appear to shift and vary is because broadcasting that you're an objectivist about a moral issue is beneficial in some contexts and harmful in others, and broadcasting that you're a relativist is beneficial in some contexts and not others. And a lot of our data just sort of points in the direction of this as a possibility. It doesn't directly demonstrate that people are motivated by these sorts of goals, but what it shows is that people are receptive to and are aware of and care about what people's apparent metaethical positions appear to signal about that person's characteristics.
That's really interesting. No, again, it's part of that whole messy business of extraneous factors that will interfere with somebody's self-reports of, anything. But it seems particularly pertinent in metaethics, considering the stereotypes, I suppose, about what a moral relativist looks like and what a moral objectivist looks like. And we have it's not like the camps view one another that favorably. So you can imagine where stereotypes might emerge. I mean, this touches upon a really interesting field generally, which is experimental philosophy, which I know you're very passionate about and interested in. A lot of people, this will just be a completely new term to them. Experimental philosophy, what is that? What are the kind of things that experimental philosophers do, and how is it relevant to metaethics as a field, or just any philosophical field? But let's stick with metaethics for now.
Sure. So experimental philosophy is a kind of movement, and you could say it's a kind of meta-philosophical approach, but basically it's the practice of philosophers conducting empirical studies in order to gain better insight into how usually non-philosophers think about traditionally philosophical topics. Sometimes experimental philosophers study other philosophers, but a big goal of experimental philosophy was basically to say, okay, well, philosophers always go around saying this is intuitive, this is counterintuitive. Okay, but to who? Is it counterintuitive, intuitive just to the philosophers? What do people that aren't even trained in philosophy, what do they think about this? And so what philosophers did is they started surveying people and running studies. This has been going on for about 20 years. It started around the early 2000s. Some big names in the field: Josh Knobe, Sean Nichols, Stephen Stitch had a big part in motivating this. So if you look up those names, you'll find a lot of the early work. Over the years, experimental philosophy took on more goals. So its only goals are not purely destructive. So one of the goals is this sort of negative project of saying, hey, philosophical intuitions are unreliable. Don't trust them. Don't use them. But sometimes it's just a question of vindicating one or another philosophical perspective. Yeah, it turns out most people do have this intuition. Philosophers said they did. So sometimes it just supports philosophy. Sometimes it, and a lot of it is shifted towards just saying, hey, look, independent of its philosophical role, it's just super interesting to figure out what people think about these things. Let's go figure it out. And so often it just becomes basic cognitive or social psychology. And you're just figuring out how people think about these things. And this has happened, for instance, with like research on free will, where it's just treated as another topic of psychology. You got personality scales, you got free will scales. How does this relate to metaethics? As I said earlier, a lot of realists appeal to this presumption of realism. So what they'll say are things like, well, realism is the common sense view. Realism is the intuitive position. And this is sometimes used to pull a burden shifting move. So realists will say, given that there's a presumption in favor of realism as the common sense view, anti-realists have the burden of proof to overcome or defeat this presumption in favor of realism. And you might compare this to the view that trees exist. You might say, yeah, it's a pretty common sense view. If someone said trees don't exist, you might say, okay, why? It's kind of your job to show why they don't exist. So you could see why realists would often, I'm not saying all realists rely on this, and it's also not integral to the realist position, but it's a common thing that realists say. So one of the things that experimental philosophy can do is potentially show that claim that most people are realists or implicitly committed to realism, or that it's a common sense view, that's not true. That it just turns out that it's not. Now, that happens to be my view. I don't think that people are realists. I also don't think people are anti-realists. I think people are kind of just neither, and that sometimes they become one or the other, but they got to study philosophy. What I like to say is it's very much like a quantum superposition, that people's philosophical views only resolve once the sort of philosophical wave function collapses. You actually have to look at philosophy to adopt a position one way or another. So that's how I view the matter. But I don't actually think that this is that dialectically relevant. Like, if it turned out most people were moral anti-realists, well, if I was a realist, I'd say, okay, well, most people are wrong. Most
Yeah.
people were wrong about the theory of evolution. Most people didn't know what the shape of the earth was. They didn't necessarily think it's thought they didn't know. So the fact that most people don't know something or don't have a view on it or hold an incorrect view, okay, well, then the realists would just say, oh, most people are wrong. Um, it that can be an issue if the realist thinks it's really, really important, the relationship between moral semantics and moral metaphysics. So if the realist thinks, look, what it means to make a moral claim just is to make a report about what the objective moral facts are. If they turn out to be wrong about that, now when they say there are these stance-independent moral truths, a, a person could say, okay, but what are you talking about? Because it's certainly not what ordinary people mean when they say that, because they're not. It turns out that's not what they mean. But I do think that realists can handle that question. They could still just say, look, there are normative or prescriptive facts about what you should or shouldn't do, or what values you ought to or ought not have, or what reasons you have for doing things that are true independent of your goals or values or those of your culture. That could be true regardless of the way moral language functions. So I don't actually think experimental philosophy can do much to directly threaten realism or anti-realism, because ultimately I view these as metaphysical positions, not as semantic positions. And that might be a controversial position. There is this paper by Kahan that says the title is "Must Moral Realism Make a Semantic Claim?" And he argues, no, it doesn't have to. But traditional analytic metaethics throughout the 20th century was so heavily focused on the question of what do moral claims mean that it was almost the practice was the practice of analyzing sentences. Like that's what they did in the 20th century.
I always think that's in some ways that's quite surprising. In this, this kind of linguistic turn stuff, it is, in some ways, a quirk. If you go and look at moral anti-realists from far before then, I mean, Nietzsche's probably the one that I'm most familiar with regarding moral theory, and Hume might be another, though I know him less well. They're not talking about language. When Nietzsche says there are no moral facts, he's making a claim about the world. He's trying to say that he's not, saying that, oh, we're doing this particular thing when we use language in a certain way. He's like, no, he's just trying to make a claim that metaphysically there do not exist moral facts, and that's what kind of makes him an anti-realist. It's very interesting, something that people probably encounter if they choose to go and read philosophy, and also choose to go and read this particular 20th century analytic philosophy, is that this distinction between semantic and metaphysical gets jumped back and forth over quite a lot. But actually, these are substantively different claims, and also that quite a lot of the time, you'll find that the semantic claim emerges in the late 19th century and then gets jettisoned in the 1970s. And sort of there's a whole kind of linguistic turn that then turns back a bit at some point. I find it very historically interesting, but I think it also does really confuse people when they go and then read some of these texts.
Very much so. It's also strange because there's all this focus on the meaning of sentences, and yet there's almost no empirical research asking the question, because they'll say things like, when the ordinary person says this, they mean to say, like Mackey says this, Ayer says this sort of thing. And then none of them ever even attempted to conduct a study to look at what people say. They didn't sit down and people talk to them. Like what? I'm baffled by this. And sometimes the reaction is just, well, we don't need to, because it's obvious what people mean. I'm an expert in the language. I don't need to consult. I don't need to go survey people to know what the word tree means or what the word dog means. I know what it means. Or to ask them about basic aspects of grammar. I don't need to ask people. So that's one attitude. Another attitude, which I find very strange and can't wrap my head around, is when people say, we're not making empirical claims. So moral realism is the common sense view, is not a claim about human psychology. What the hell kind of claim is it? I don't even know what they mean at that point. But they do, some of them do appear to take the positions to not, at least in a straightforward way, be empirical, or at least not readily amenable to empirical investigation. Now, sometimes people can cash out what they mean. There's a great paper by Kauppinen called The Rise and Fall of Experimental Philosophy, where he says, look, the characteristics that you would have to meet to try to solicit a response from a non-philosopher they're too complicated. You're not going to be able to pull it off. And so you really shouldn't rely on the sort of surface intuitions that people report in experimental philosophy surveys. And so we should be extremely skeptical of them. I should agree with that. But what I don't think, and what he thinks, is that he thinks the solution is let's just do philosophy the way that we ordinarily do. we sit down in the armchair and we think about it because we're experts. I don't buy into that either. And so then that raises the question, well, what do I think we can do? Ah, I don't know. So if we want to figure these questions out, it turns out it's really, really hard. And I'm not there yet. Like I point out problems, but I'm not very good at providing solutions. So this language thing, I do think that it has a role. I don't think it has the role it seemed to have in the mid 20th century. But it's what one problem with it is, even though you're right, I think we've started to move away from it in the past 50 years or so. It still has this overwhelming impact on the entire discourse because, for instance, all of those traditional positions I mentioned, naturalist and non-naturalist realism, non-cognitivism, error theory, relativism, all of those positions are framed fundamentally in terms of their position on moral semantics. Now, there's a metaphysical component to all of them, but the semantic component is virtually ineliminable from them as well, and that's a problem.
No, absolutely. I think that generally I find that quite often in philosophy, when we are doing language stuff, broadly construed, be that trying to find definitions of things or trying to clarify particular positions or so on and so on, quite often there does seem to be at least a kind of implicit break whereby a fair few philosophers seem to think that we are examining something that's already there, whereas other set of philosophers seem to think we're doing something entirely different, which is making a concept more helpful for future use. I'm also often taken aback by how much this goes under the radar, because on the surface they involve quite similar activities. But I mean, I find interesting as somebody who's very much down the kind of, I'm not so much interested in finding out what knowledge is, whereas I'm much more interested in crafting a very, very helpful set of tools for investigating the world. And that might involve, not just one definition of knowledge, but a whole series of definitions for different situations. Now, this might be I find it very interesting because that disagreement you often only find out about it after a long time of discussing things, thinking that you're on the same page about it. It's the attitude of how should philosophy treat language, especially with the fact that, unlike air, we now have empirical data on how people use words. One of my favorite papers that I've read recently was empirical study on how people use the term deep. When they describe a statement, we think, we hear excerpts from the Tao Te Ching, and some people will say, oh, that's deep, and other people will say, oh, that's pseudo profound. But actually, surveying people on what they mean by the word deep and how they react to different statements, calling them deep or not deep, and why it seems like very, very useful data when we're going about answering some of these philosophical questions. But at the same time, there does seem to be a disconnect between the aim of taking ordinary language, whatever you take that to mean, and specifying it to the point of trying to come up with necessary and sufficient condition for something. And then on the other hand, attempting a kind of more future-looking philosophy of language of, what's the best way we can engineer these concepts to do our inquiry most efficiently or most effectively.
Yeah. It's frustrating. And you're right about that part. You don't figure out that people are doing this until you've read a bunch of philosophy. And then you're like, wait, is this person saying this is how people do speak or do use that term? Or are they saying this is how they should use the term because it's really clear and helpful? And often, like, you could ask someone and then they'll be like, I'm not sure which one I'm trying to do here. And it looks sometimes like people are straddling the line between the two. Like they kind of want something that is kind of mostly capturing what we want what we think the term is typically doing. We don't want to deviate too far from that, but we want to clean it up a bit. So it's more like we're putting makeup on our words rather than that we're inventing whole other uses for the words. Like we're trying to sculpt them rather than craft them from nothing. It's hard to say what people take themselves to be doing. And it's very frustrating because analytic philosophy, there's a lot of disputes and battles right now between analytic philosophy and continental philosophy. And analytic is supposed to pride itself on its clarity. And it does do a pretty good job of that, I think, in certain subdomains. Philosophers are really good at taking a big jumbled mess of text and saying, here's a syllogism I could pull out of the text. Premise 1, premise 2, conclusion. They are good at that. But they often are not so good at clarifying, for instance, their aims. Like, why are you presenting this argument? What are you trying to do here? And so they're like, weirdly, there's these lacuna in what they're up to, where they're just missing parts of what they could be more clear about. One of the things I hassle people a lot about, to the point where a couple of people have mocked me about this, which I'll take, because I think it's right to keep doing this anyway. If philosophers will say that's intuitive, or this is counterintuitive, or it seems that. So they might say, oh, it seems that there's an external world. It seems that way to who? To you? To people in general? To people that are competent judges on the matter? Like, what do you mean when you say it seems? I think philosophers should strive to always qualify what they mean when they make statements like that. Instead of just saying it's intuitive that, is say, I find it intuitive that, and I think most of my readers will. Just be specific, be precise about that, because when you're not precise about that, it could mislead people into thinking that, yeah, it's intuitive, it's something to accept. Kind of perhaps analogous to what you were pointing out about in studies, people want to be cooperative. If I just say it's intuitive that and I keep going, people want to be cooperative. Yeah, okay, let's see where you're going with this. But if someone says, I find it intuitive that, but I have no idea if anybody else does, that is immediately, I might step back and go, okay, well, I don't find it intuitive, so I'm not going to follow you on this argumentative point. So I think that it would weaken a lot of what philosophers say if they had to be clear about what claims they're making, because people might start to question those claims. But at the same time, I think it's the sort of very open, honest approach to doing this sort of thing. I'm not saying people are dishonest when they don't say this. I'm saying that there's a kind of negligence in clarity that could improve a lot of philosophy. And more generally, I think philosophers should be clear about what their objectives are and what their methods are. And I don't think it's clear what the methods of analytic philosophy are.
I know what you mean. I've kind of, my personal goal now, if I catch myself saying that's intuitive, I now have my habit is to replace it with I have a hunch, because that's basically what I mean. I mean, I have a hunch, and like, but you're right. It's a certain kind of. I think that there are. I mean, broadening our discussion out to kind of philosophy more generally, there are a series of ways of writing, and I share a kind of admiration for the clarity of analytic philosophy at its best. Because, as I say, we were chatting before the call, Frank Ramsey, his papers are complicated, but you know what he means. He's just there every step of the way. And there are a couple of things I do occasionally think that philosophy papers sometimes do, where they will dress up a claim that I think is properly just a bit more circumscribed, as using language like, oh, that's intuitive, to sort of almost make it intrude on a slightly larger domain. Whereas, I find it intuitive. It's perfectly, you can use that as a premise in your argument. You're allowed to. And other people who share that intuition and thus accept a given thing as true, that'll be in their stock of beliefs. If you're then making an argument based on that, that's fine. If the conditional still follows, the conditional still follows. You're gonna end up in the same place with the people that begin with that intuition. So yeah, no, I kind of agree. I mean, another thing that I say, for those of you who aren't on Substack, one of the reasons why Lance and I are talking about this is because for the past couple of weeks there's been this whole analytic, well, it's a very old debate, the analytic versus continental debate, has kind of resurged a little bit. But yes, I do think that there are a series of ways in which I think analytic philosophers do write very clearly, but there are a series of ways in which I think that they don't write necessarily very clearly. And sometimes inferences are hidden where I think potentially they ought to be brought more to the surface. Because my background is more in logic, the one that I pick up on a lot, partly because I catch myself doing it sometimes. And I don't think it's always intentional, because I think sometimes you just live in a particular formal system for a while and then you fool your mind into thinking that it is reality. Is this kind of argumentum from formalism, where you just you have a very nice formal system and then you end up thinking, God, I think the world must be like that. Because, I've got this Kripke frame. I think that knowledge might actually just be about possible worlds. I think that might just be it. And actually, you might be able to make that argument, but it requires a link between the formalism and the world. That can't be assumed at the outset.
Yeah. And that is drawn in by the formalism. I do think that William James is onto something when he said that he says in pragmatism that there's like tender-hearted philosophers and like hard, or does he say tender-minded and hard-minded? I forget the exact phrasing. But you basically, and he doesn't mean anything very super pejorative by either of those terms. But there's these different attitudes that he hypothesizes that philosophers tend to take, and that they roughly fall into those that want these like clean, formal, like ideal, sort of Platonic, like there's all the geometric forms, and they want philosophy to be like that. And then there's the hard-minded ones that are more maybe empiricist, and they everything is messy, and there's like look at look at a periodic table. That thing doesn't look elegant to me. We tried to make it elegant, but there's like little arrows, and this thing goes with that, and things are in weird categories. Reality is a big mess. And so some people, I think, are more dispositionally inclined towards that clean view, and then some people towards the messy view. And I am deep on the messy side, like all the way extreme over. It was like a 100-point scale. I'm a 100 on that. This stuff's real messy. And I like logic and formal stuff. I think they're useful tools, but I think that they're useful tools for creating order amidst the chaos. I don't think that they actually represent what reality is like. Whereas other people think all the chaos is like an illusion, and that beneath the surface, there's the underlying order. And I think those might just be different dispositions that converge on capturing the same reality. And I think there's something interesting and kind of beautiful about that. I don't like to get poetic about philosophy because I'm supposed to be in the hard-minded. It's ridiculous. I just say I'm the hard-minded side, and it's beautiful. But there's something to, I think, cognitive diversity bringing something of value to philosophy. And one of the things that really worries me about philosophy is that what we've been discussing this entire conversation is only analytic philosophy. And analytic philosophy is a recent outgrowth of Western philosophy that is, analytic philosophy, you could basically call it English philosophy. And that wouldn't be that far off. It's Anglophone philosophy. It's philosophy done in English. Now, that doesn't mean everybody that's an analytic philosopher is like a native English speaker or something like that. But it is like literally, if you look up what the discipline is, it's an Anglophone form of philosophy. Most of the people doing it are from the United States, or they're from the UK, or they're from Canada, and people that even come from different cultures and speak different languages, and come from different backgrounds, are still typically going to write and publish and read and study and work with people in English. And so we're all getting funneled through this very narrow cultural lens through which we end up viewing the world. And it's not even because our cultures already influence our positions. We're not just being westernized, like hyper-westernized and hyper-anglified when we're studying the discipline in analytic philosophy. We're reading the shared corpus of the exact same group of people. You and I have both read Hume. You and I have both read Mill. You and I have read the exact same people saying the exact same words in the exact same language. And that can tune all of our brains to be a little closer together in terms of how we view the world, in a way that sort of shunts away the possible ways that people could think about philosophical matters in ways that are insightful and bring something to the table. And that sort of methodological and perspectival winnowing of the field, I think, is not good for us. I think that we need outside perspectives, and I don't know how to fix that, but I do think that that's a problem.
No, absolutely. I mean, I've kind of gone through a bit of a journey in the past few years from basically just sort of doing logic and thinking this is great, and my ultimate philosophical goal is to make everything this, and sort of as I imagine a lot of kind of young, very analytically minded philosophers will want to do. I got into philosophy through Ayer and Carnap, just because I was confused about people using language, and I thought, we'll make this more precise, and then all of my problems will be fixed, and I'll have more friends. And and then you kind of you get to the end of it, and you think, people are very irritated by all that, and also I'm just not convinced that we can do this incredibly precise logical language that I thought was possible. And then, as I say, in the past few years, I've been doing a lot more kind of fiction reading and a lot more continental philosophy, and reading continental philosophy and thinking, this very difficult to pin down, and yet, undeniably, occasionally I stumble across something and I think, no, that's very insightful. And actually, I think analytic philosophers could benefit from reading this and chewing on it, even though it's sometimes a pain in the arse to read. And even though I think, no field of philosophy is exclusively good stuff. There's always a mixture of good stuff and not so good stuff. But I share your skepticism about just getting too fixed into thinking, okay, I'm gonna investigate every question as if I am sort of a clone of Frege, and I'm just gonna follow that through to the end. It is I think limiting, and I think that maybe this is where my own kind of, I don't know, soft-heartedness or whatever comes back in, is that this idea of having, methodological pluralism isn't everything, but I think that fixed methodological monism is, by definition, it's limiting you to other perspectives. Maybe it will turn out that is the best perspective. I'm skeptical. I think that we can definitely learn things from lots and lots of other fields. But nonetheless, I think it's worth exploring, at the very least, opening ourselves up to a broader kind of methodology here. And if that's a failed experiment, that's a failed experiment. But I'm very keen on questioning the orthodoxy here, because I think that it can get very, very unhelpful. And at its worst, I think it potentially leads to situations where people will come across some philosophy papers and think this is useless. I don't know where I'm going to use this. I don't know where this fits in. This doesn't seem to be connected with reality as like I experience it in our phenomenal world. And that's where I think, well, that's not a healthy state for an inquiry to be in. I think it's important to try and keep things tethered to the ground, because we can build abstractions upon abstractions and for probably forever. But that, I'm a big believer, and maybe this is just a kind of pre-existing value commitment more than anything, in trying to make philosophy as cashing out on ground level behaviors and dispositions as humanly possible. And some that will involve some methodological pluralism, I think.
Yeah, and it really should. And not all of the traditions that have been sort of shunted away from mainstream analytic philosophy are necessarily like these like hyper divergent, super abnormal positions. I share your sentiment here. It could turn out that the analytic philosophical approach is the best of the bunch and we should largely stick with it. I find it very unlikely that if we were to open the floodgates and let all these other methodological perspectives in, that there would be no changes to what we do. I would expect it to at least be able to absorb some insights and modify itself in some positive ways. And it's also important not to stress that I don't think every methodology is equally good. I don't have this view like this like hyper postmodernist view that if someone their philosophy is I flip coins and then I pick positions on a list. Yeah, I'm not down with that. I'm not going to do that, and I'm not gonna like consider that very long. I might laugh at it, but I wouldn't do it. So there is that. Like I don't think either of us are that methodologically open-minded. So there is that. But you take traditions like experimental philosophy has not been received super warmly by everybody. And so often even movements within Western philosophy are not super well received by analytic philosophers. And for me, one of the biggest, you could look at the history, like ordinary language philosophy, people say it's dead. Logical positivism, they say it's dead. And often the narratives about what killed these views off are overblown. I think that they're exaggerated. And I think that they give the misleading impression that there was nothing of value and no insights to extract from any of these perspectives, even if you don't adopt them. I often find myself extremely sympathetic to what logical positivists would say about this or that issue.
Absolutely.
Does that mean I need to buy into it like a religion? No, but it does mean I'm like, they make a lot of good points here. It's kind of weird to just say it's dead. That's a weird stance to take. But I think one of the biggest ones, and what's interesting about it is because it's often considered like uniquely American in its origins as pragmatism. I think pragmatism is this profoundly powerful approach to philosophy. And if you look at, for instance, the Phil Paper survey, you'll see almost nobody on there calls themselves a pragmatist. So pragmatism, elements of it were reabsorbed into many contemporary analytic philosophers' approach to where they might say, I'm a pragmatist about this, or I have a pragmatist influences. But I rarely see anybody just say out and out, I'm just all in on James. I'm a Jamesian pragmatist. I almost never see that.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, if I was going to pick a metaphilosophical position, it would definitely be pragmatism. But I think it'll be more of the kind of Peircean version. I'm very, very into Peirce, and I'm very, very into Ramsey. And I think that there's definitely something in, for those listening, pragmatism, again, it's very difficult to pin down because pragmatists believe a lot of different things. But a kind of decent maxim is that pragmatists tend to try and, at the very least, ground out, reconnect any philosophy back down to practice in some sense. I mean, perhaps more recently, it's become more associated with a kind of with also a kind of naturalism about people. People have kind of, Hugh Price has tried to bill pragmatism as a kind of subject naturalism, where it's a way of philosophy that continues to treat people as naturalistic objects in the world and refuses to at any point divorce itself from that conception of the human, and then arguing that some form of pragmatism falls out of that. Yeah, I think it's interesting you bring up logical positivism as well. Something that I was surprised by, actually, when I went back and read some Carnap and some Ayer more recently in the past year, was that actually some of the criticisms that I would hear a lot at university just weren't actually attacking what they said. That we do. People talk about straw manning. We all know straw manning is a bad thing, but it's very easy to straw man without really realizing it, especially when you're looking at something 100 years later and you're viewing it through the lens of 100 years of other people's stacked lenses. Very few people go into reading Air without thinking, oh, this is a logical positivist text, and I know about logical positivism because my lecturer told me about it, and I already know that quote unquote, nobody believes in this anymore. So I'm kind of going in thinking, oh, this is probably a bit unfounded. And you see Air use a term like literally significant. And you, in your head, go, oh, he just means meaningful. And it's like, no. Literally significant is a term that he defines within this. And then you end up with, as I've mentioned this on the channel before, people saying things like the verification principle is meaningless by Air's own light, which I just don't think it is. He defines it. It's a truth by definition that's then justified as a kind of tool. He says that he's worried about fruitless philosophizing, and this is his way to get us to the fruitful stuff, which is, that's a far more plausible starting point than what I think a lot of people end up thinking that he means, which is something like trying to have a grand theory of semantic meaning, which I don't think is quite his point in Language, Truth, and Logic.
Yeah, I do think that they've just sort of glommed onto and just imbibed this narrative that, that logical positivism is self-refuting. It's not so clear that it is. I don't know exactly what people have said that allegedly killed off ordinary language philosophy. There are living representatives of these views that are still working at them in some fashion or form. Others, Liam Coffey Bright, I think I think his handles, maybe it's on Twitter or something, he's like the last positivist. So he's certainly somebody worth talking to. And he's just awesome and full of insights. And every time I hear him talk about it, it's great. And so he's made similar remarks, maybe not exactly the same as yours, but basically addressing the critiques of positivism and where they fall short. At least that's my understanding. Maybe I'm not remembering exactly what he said in defense.
I'll definitely look him up. So that sounds really interesting.
Yeah, he's great. And also Avner Boz has written some stuff on trying to bring back ordinary language philosophy and has critiqued a lot of mainstream philosophy. I'm trying to remember the names of the books that he put out. They're just not coming to my mind. But so these views are still around. When people say they're dead, that often seems like this bandwagon narrative that people just buy into. It's dead. Leave it alone. Leave it alone. Maybe it's an easy way to compartmentalize. Like, hey, I don't want to open up that whole Pandora's box and have to examine all those views. It's easy to just say they're dead. Now, I'm attributing kind of bad motives to people, so maybe I shouldn't be doing that. But I do think there's a bit of this kind of like groupthinky enculturation thing that we undergo, and I was subject to this. Oh, these views are dead; they're dead. And I do think we have to actively combat that tendency to just buy into narratives. And I think a big part of this, and I should really practice what I preach. I don't often do so. Is people need to read the primary texts. For some reason, this seems to have not become it, like it's a trend now of just not reading what Ayer had to say, not reading, what, like, I got a lot out of reading Nietzsche. I thought Nietzsche is like super insightful and cool and awesome and worth reading, and very fun to read. And that was some of my earliest reading in philosophy, and it had a big influence on me. And when I see caricatures of Nietzsche, they're often incorrect. And it took like really active efforts for instance, to sort of revive Nietzsche's reputation within philosophy. Like Walter Kaufmann did work on this. Similar efforts often just haven't been made by people to really rescue valuable philosophical perspectives that have been maligned by the mainstream perspective. And I think that there's aspects of this that have happened in other fields. Like, I'm in psychology, and when you look at the critiques of behaviorism, they're not that good. They're just not that good. Now, does that mean I think that we all need to be on some sort of like behaviorist kick and everybody should just be Skinnerian all the way down? No, not at all. But, this is something that I think a couple people, I'm trying to recall, a weird person that mentioned this, Julian Jaynes, in the book, The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, right at the start of that, talks about how Skinner was important in cleaning up a lot of the sloppy methods and lack of precision in psychology. And I think that's right. And that's a weird place to get the source from. But I wanted to attribute the source. Of like, who said that? Oh, I think it was Julian Jaynes. But I think behaviorism was like really important for psychology and not something for people to dismiss so readily. Like rigor and precision and repetition and the the importance of like motivation at a very fundamental level, I think is, if anything, undervalued in contemporary psychology. I mean, so much contemporary psychology has focused on beliefs to the exclusion that forgetting and ignoring that we are humans with social goals. This is why I care so much about signaling hypotheses. People don't just go around just reporting what's true. People are trying to do things. People are trying to achieve things. They're trying to be happier. They're trying to have status. They're trying to be popular. They're trying to be wealthy. And those motivations are such central features of what is driving people that it would be really weird not to think that those motivations aren't, for instance, influencing what people are doing when they're doing philosophy. And that, if we turn ourselves inward and look back on and hold a mirror up to philosophy as an academic institution, like academic philosophy, I think we should be quite concerned about whether or not the popularity of a view is driven by, someone seeing, hey, this is a popular view. I can advance my career by publishing on this topic. It would be weird if people weren't doing that on some implicit level, because they realize like, hey, I got to have a job. I want to do this. I want to do the thing I love. So I'll write about the thing that's popular. And there is support for this in the sciences, where when scientists are surveyed, do you do research on what you really want to do? The answer is frequently no. I do research on what I think I could get grant funding for. And so it would be shocking if the same wasn't true of philosophy. And so the picture that we get at any time we take like a slice, a cross section of what's being talked about in philosophy, I don't think that's that great of an indicator of what's true or what's important or what's valuable. I think a lot of it is just driven by the winds of fashion. And that should make us at least a bit more skeptical about where philosophy is currently at.
Absolutely. I think that fashion, a lot of fields go through fashions, and I think philosophy is no exception. I think in a lot of ways it is very prone to them. There's this, as the kind of the philosophical phenomenon of a kind of intellectual titan walking onto the scene, and people sort of just wanting to be a part of that. It's a very natural human motivation. I imagine that if I were around in 1920s Vienna, I would go, yeah, I really want to be part of the Vienna Circle. These guys are doing really exciting stuff, and moreover, it seems cool and new and sexy. I think that one of the things I cover a lot of historical philosophy on the channel. And one of the things I try to remind people of is that is to try and encounter them as if they're not historical, and try and encounter them as if you haven't heard anything about them before. For example, I talked about pantheism the other day, and I'm not a pantheist, but I'm not a theist of any kind. But just thinking, yeah, it's very easy to think this is so much less plausible than the major world religions. But how much of that is historically contingent social factors rather than philosophical factors? It's okay to have a philosophical argument against them, but it's a kind of dismissal via historical ridicule is something that it's so easy to do, especially if they seem ridiculous because you haven't heard them very much before. And I think one of the reasons why it's so helpful to reflect on that is because it then you have the opportunity to turn that lens inwards and think, okay, like, what do I think that if I had never thought it before and it wasn't thought by the people around me, I would think that's really ridiculous. And for example, that's one of the reasons why I abandoned the metaphysical correspondence theory of truth, because I thought, if I encountered this and I hadn't been at an institution where the correspondence theory of truth is the most popular theory of truth, what would I react to it? And I think, no, I'd be very, very skeptical. And so I thought, yeah, that I ought to be very, very skeptical, because I would have been if it hadn't been for certain contingent social factors.
Yeah, a good test of this. I like that approach, trying to think of the counterfactual. If this weren't the mainstream view, how would I react? What I like to do to test some of these ideas is to try to give a very straightforward and simple explanation of the methods or the topic of focus that philosophers take when approaching an issue. And one of the ones you'll get is when you start talking in metaethics about this like massive emphasis on analyzing English sentences. People are like, what the hell? Why would you do that? Why would that be the way you would start trying to address this question, is assessing the meaning of a sentence. That's a very weird way to do things. And I do think that that generalizes to a lot of what people are doing in philosophy. I do think I haven't asked too many people about intuition, but I would be curious about the sort of meta question of like asking people outside of philosophy, what do you think of the fact that philosophers use intuition? But intuition runs into this problem of polysemy that's so extreme that, and the other problem I wanted to mention about intuition is it also has an ordinary language or colloquial set of usages that don't even comport with this usage among philosophers, at least some of those uses. And that's different from a lot of other terms that philosophers might use. I'm trying to think of one like some technical term philosophers use. Certainly something like Platonic, like if you're naming something after somebody, people are not going to just assume that well, actually, Platonic has an ordinary language use.
Phenomenal is, I think, a good example.
Yeah, phenomenal. That might work. Although technically, there's like people will say, "Oh, that food was phenomenal," so there is a use, but I think well, that's divergent enough that most people aren't going to conflate it. And I don't think most people, if you say I'm a Platonist, they think that you're like in favor of like non-sexual friendships or something. So I don't think people are mixing up the colloquial uses, but they do sure seem to mix up colloquial uses in the case of intuition, and certainly in the case of stuff like consciousness. It's very hard. But I've run into a lot of people that if you start talking about consciousness and like from a philosophical perspective, you're talking about phenomenal consciousness and qualia, like what it's like to have experiences. And they think you're just talking about stuff like awareness. This is not what I'm talking about. So that can often be a hurdle. So yeah, one thing to do is to just try to say, here's how philosophers approach this issue to non-philosophers, and then just see how they react. And if the reaction is, what? Why would you do that? I think that's maybe a good indication that our sort of conventional framing of the issue is maybe a bit weird.
Fantastic. And just to finish off, where can people find you?
Oh, okay. So people can find me on my blog. It's called Lance Independent. On my channel, my YouTube channel is called Lance Independent. I'm also on TikTok, also called Lance Independent. So I'm Lance Independent everywhere. My name is Lance Bush. I'm in a description for all those places. You'll find links to like where you could contact me if you want to, like my email and all that stuff. So pretty easy to find if you just look up Lance Independent in those places.
Amazing. And your blog and channel and TikTok will be linked in the description.
Awesome.
Fantastic.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming. I really enjoyed this.